needed to convert a bunch of bash scripts into Ansible. Well, so have I, and I picked up a couple of tricks over the last few years that might be really helpful, especially if you look at the Ansible documentation and you look at your scripts and think, I don't know how to make these work. My name is Emma Foley. Sorry, I'm a senior software engineer on the OpenStack observability team, and for the last 5 years I've, among other things, written a lot of Ansible and also taught other people how to write a lot of Ansible. Maybe not the best Ansible, maybe some questionable quality in there, but it works, and in my experience, something that works but is imperfect is better than something that does not work at all but is really pretty. Okay, before we get started, a little bit of orientation on what this presentation is, what it aims to do and what it doesn't aim to do. I'm going to talk about a recent adventure I've had where I did need to put something into Ansible, and with this talk in mind, I made it a little bit more, I took a few extra steps in order to demonstrate the process. After that, I will provide some guidance for you to set off on your own adventures and do a little roundup at the end. Orientation. Why would you want to do this? Well, you have bash scripts that you want to run in Zuul, for example, to verify whatever you want to verify. You're tired of running your scripts manually against multiple different hosts because that gets messy after a while. And you're sold on the benefits of Ansible and you want to convert your bash scripts. I'm not judging on your reasons. I'm here to tell you how to do it in a user-friendly way. So what's this presentation? It's me sharing my experiences of converting from Bash to Ansible, what I learned along the way. It's a beginner-friendly way to learn some Ansible, and it's one way to approach this. You can do something else if you want, but I find this method works for me because I like to actually do things in order to learn, and having small incremental steps that I can take is really useful. This is not an Ansible tutorial. And is not a set of best practices. What you learn here is enough to cause trouble, either for yourself or others. You learn how to get from a script into a playbook and start incrementally improving. And you learn some of the basics to help you with additional learning, whether that's external resources or some patterns in Ansible to answer your own questions when you have them. What you need to know before we start is that Ansible has modules, tasks, and playbooks. Playbook is the YAML file that you run. It consists of a bunch of plays. Tasks are the individual execution units within Ansible, and each task runs a particular module that has a particular function. The documentation for Ansible is really helpful. At least in the built-in modules, every single documentation page has really useful examples if you scroll down to the end, which I find is much more helpful when you're starting out than a list of parameters that it takes. And it also covers a couple of very common use cases for particular modules. And Ansible also has linting tools, particularly Ansible lint, which is useful for telling you why you've gone wrong in Ansible. And it does more than just enforce style, it can also suggest when a better module could be used, which is very helpful. What you don't need to know is anything about Ansible variable precedence. I think the number of levels of precedence is like 25. Don't need to know that here. You don't need to know really about plays, about roles, about Ansible plugins. That comes later when you figure out what you want to do. And you don't need to know what an Ansible project is typically structured like, because we're just using a single playbook today. And as you move forward on your journey, you can refactor that into a more Ansible structure yourself. And you don't need to know any set of Ansible modules, except these 5, which I will briefly tell you about. These are the ones that I use most often when I'm starting out, because when I start writing anything in Ansible, I usually have a set of commands that I have run in the command line, and the first thing to do that is just drop everything into an Ansible playbook, usually using the shell module. This is the closest you have running a shell script. You can redirect variables, you can redirect output, you can set environment variables and everything. But it is a little slow, which is why typically command is recommended. It's a bit faster, but you also can't do any kind of output redirection, so no pipes. The assert and fill module do similar things. It lets you to assert that a particular condition has been met, or set of conditions have been met, and customize a failure or success message. Fail just always fails, and it is used in combination with a when to have a playbooks fail when certain conditions are met. There are reasons to use one over the other, and if we have time at the end, I go into that. And debug is basically your print line. It can output a message or a variable, and you can see what's actually going on. Okay. Let's see. Lost my cursor. Okay. So this is what I have been doing recently. I've been deploying Cloud Kitty and trying to verify that it is working as expected. And eventually we're going to add some more verification. I know it's going to be in Ansible, so I've taken some of the documentation from Cloud Kitty and just run those commands. And right here I have just dropped them into a shell task. And actually you could stop here, but that wouldn't be with the spirit of actually using Ansible. And there are some advantages to moving onwards from this. This technically works. If you really didn't want to do Ansible to begin with, you can stop here because it works. And in fact, this is a starting point for a lot of different things. Like in OpenStack historically, we had something else before Zuul. We had Jenkins, it was all bash scripts, and in order to convert them, there was some automation done to literally drop the scripts into a structure like this and get them to run in Zuul. This looks the same. What it's actually doing is relevant at the moment. What we need to do in order to break this up into separate tasks so that we can more usefully address the behavior in it is we have a bunch of environment variables up there at the top, which if we want to split this up into multiple shell tasks, either we're going to repeat all of those or we want to set them as variables in Ansible so we're not repeating ourselves, because the shell tasks are isolated from each other. So the way we set variables in Ansible is a set fact, and that looks like this. There are other ways as well to set variables, but this for me is the most, the easiest to like grok what's going on. And you may develop preferences over time. This works, it does what you expect it to do. And in order to use any of these variables, we can reference them in strings using this mustache operator, which is the double parentheses, or the double curly braces. And that will do the exact same thing as the previous bash script. So now that we have some of our variables taken care of, we want to look at when you're exporting a value to use later, like from a dynamic output. And what you can do to do this is register the output of a particular command. This part here is more useful. So at the top part we have a shell, and you can see what was there previously, and we take out the environment variable and use the register keyword on the task. That captures the output of the task, which is not a string but a structure, And every single module that you use will have some kind of output, and this will work even if you're not using shell or command anymore. And because it's a structure, we have to reference it slightly differently. For the shell module, the outputs that are relevant are RC, standard out, standard error. And those standard out and standard error also have a second equivalent output as a list of the lines individually. So in this case, we're referring to the variables later with that standard out element. This might be one of the things that trips up beginners at the very start. And at this point, you can split everything up into its own shell commands and run something like Ansible lint, which will tell you what's going on, what you've done wrong, and it will be more addressable because you have smaller little tasks. This is something we're going to address in the next one. Ansible, is one of the advantages of it is the idempotency. You lose that when you use just shell or commands. But there are some modifiers or parameters we can add to the tasks in order to get a little bit more of that and to have a useful report at the end that actually tells you when you've changed some kind of state in the system, or to modify the custom failure, to add custom failure conditions to tasks. Like, for example, you might get an error, but because you're trying to create a resource, and if the error says the resource is already there, you don't necessarily want to stop the execution of your playbook. However, if you get an error and it says, oh yeah, the resource isn't available because I can't connect to the internet, in that case you might want to search the output for a particular string value. So in this case, if there's already like two resources with the same name, we can't go forwards. So we would mark it as failed. In this case, it's not really doing anything. The only time it could actually fail is if the resource already exists, so we just ignore the errors always. And this is like completely customizable, and it will depend on your applications. Okay, and there's nothing else interesting in that. This is adding a couple of more failed when and changed when, and at some point after this presentation I will add a link to these commits in, probably not in this actual thing, but I will add a link to the examples, and it is much easier to peruse yourselves on something a little bit closer and more interactive. Okay, and go. So, in summary, you start with a shell script, you wrap the whole thing in a single shell task. You could be done now, but if you want to continue on your journey, move environment variables into set fact so you can reuse them again. If you have output from particular commands, save and reuse them using register. Run Ansible lint for help, because it's actually really useful if you're looking at the output in something that will actually parse the markup. You can use fail when and change when for custom failure and change conditions, so that you actually know if something on your system has been changed, or you can ignore errors selectively. Oh, I didn't do this one. If you have errors, you can use the block rescue always structure, which is basically try, accept, and finally. You'd find it the same as a task. It can have a name and so on. All the tasks that are in there. If there's an always after it, there's something that happens. and you want something to happen no matter what the outcome, like for example, you create some resources in your tests, and you want it always cleaned up no matter whether the tasks fail or not, you would put that in the always. And similar with rescue, but that's only if something fails. So if you want to have like nicer debug output or something that you typically would want to avoid if everything is running well. You replace tasks one by one, you don't have to do it all in one go. And you use the command module or any other module where possible, because they obviously have the nice built-in features of Ansible. That would be a draw to actually use it. But I'm telling you to use the other modules where possible, but you might be wondering how do you convince yourself it works? Because it's quite different from what you might be used to if you're writing shell scripts. I always say to write a playbook, and no one here would believe the amount of dumb playbooks I've actually written, and in fact I can't even quantify it because I've lost a lot of them. And this is also something I do when I'm giving code reviews to people, is I'll write them a playbook so they can test out the behavior. And it's not just for converting to a particular module. If there's any kind of behaviors in Ansible you're not sure of, you can write a playbook to test it. And this might sound obvious to some people, but to other people it could be a revelation as well. I don't think we have time for both of these, but I'll call them 0 and 1, so shout out which example you want to look at.
0.
0. I don't like audience participation either. Okay, so, as I said, this is like a really dumb one. We're cloning stuff in Git. If you run Ansible lint on this, it'll come up with an output that says, use the module instead of command. And it'll tell you which module to use, in this case Git. But once you start adding multiple different options to your Git command, it can be hard to figure out whether or not it has the right effect. And in this case, all I've done is cloned it using command, then cloned it using the Git module, and then run a shell command with diff to say, did it clone the same thing? And I used -s because I don't always trust shell commands that don't give you any output because it may not have run. And the way to check this is working is you just run it and inspect the output. In other cases, you can automatically check the outputs as well and have fail or assert give you helpful messages, which I usually do if I'm having a really slow day and I can't remember what the output is supposed to be. And it's also useful to give as an example for folks that are new at Ansible so they know what's going on as well. Okay, so key takeaways from this is you can get more information. I didn't look at failure search, but both are useful for getting additional information and actually triggering a failure or success condition of your tasks, and therefore a playbook, depending on whether certain conditions are met. Both of them let you set custom messages for failure. Assert lets you set custom messages also for success, which is really useful if you're testing that multiple different conditions have been met, because then you can customize the output to tell you which ones have been met or not met. Yes, assert. Assert is needed if you want to explicitly set success conditions, because fail will always fail. So the task output will be failed or skipped. But if you want something explicitly to be passed, you have to use assert, which can also be skipped, but will also give you a fail or success status. Okay. This is what fail looks like. This one part is any kind of condition. This is variables that are in Ansible, in this case checking the output from I think that was a grep. And similar something here, we're counting the number of matches we had in grep. This is an example of a search. So we're checking that multiple conditions have been met, and there's a nice error message. And because we're checking for multiple conditions, we then have like this templating in the output to tell you whether something is passed or failed, or which condition has not been met. Useful substitutions. This is helpful to go from shell to command. Something that we used to use very often is just check the number of lines in the output. And my code review always says use standard outlines length to check the same thing. And this also has the additional benefit that if it does fail, you have more helpful output rather than like a 1 or a 0. And here's another example. And this actually, when we removed the WC-L, we found out there were additional failure conditions that we were missing. So we were able to enhance the command. And oh, actually, I just realized that some of the coloring is not obvious there, but they are git diffs. So that one went away, and these ones got added. Another one, and this is back to like the second last example. If you want to search for some kind of string in your output, if it's just that there are any instances of it, you can use like, is the string in a variable? In this case, there's also other changes, but like this and this are the equivalent ones, and we've inverted the condition because one of them is a success criteria and one of them is a fail. But the idea is the same. You can search for a particular string in an output. If you want to actually consume that output in some way, you can also use the ORI search filter. There's a bunch of different filters that you can use in Ansible to actually search through the output as well, if you need to consume it. Here's another one. Very often you want to wait for something to happen. You use sleep for a certain amount of time in shell. The direct substitution in Ansible would be to use the pause module, but that's not recommended for multiple different reasons, including the fact that shell commands are usually run sequentially rather than being able to be run in parallel. And if you're running this against multiple hosts, that's a lot of wait time. What I always add in is do retry until. These are both things you can add to your task to modify its behavior. So in this case, we'll retry for up to 2 minutes, which 5 seconds between it, and do it up to 24 times. And this until states what the success condition is so that it can break earlier. So you're not progressively adding more wait time to your jobs, for example, because you have some flaky dependencies out there that may or may not respond. And you keep adding more time so that it'll definitely eventually resolve itself. Failed when, if you have some flaky dependencies, typically a task is run just once, especially shell or command. I think some of the other modules have their built-in retries, but if you want to simulate that, retry, delay, and until. So that's how many times to retry it in case it fails the first time. And until, rather than setting a fail condition with failed when, it sets a success condition for when it actually is successful. You can still add failed when because you might have different success versus failure conditions, but in this case it is like just the inverse of what we had before. And for switching up to modules, these are some very common ones, and the most common ones that I've used. You can use other ones as well, but these are the ones that I found most helpful directly. And usually if you Google like Ansible modules to do this, you will find some good references, and you can apply the same kind of pattern with the playbook in order to test whether it actually does what you want it to do by checking for the particular side effects that it has. And on the parameters you can use to modify your tasks, register variables, add custom failure or change conditions, add some resiliency and retries with the retry delay, set some success conditions with until, and also conditionally execute your tasks using when. These are useful references. They're more useful if you can click the links, but this will be shared later. The Ansible documentation is great. You can also access it on the command line using the Ansible doc tool. And it has all the same information, and you can actually set the output to your preferred format as well. And Ansible lint is really good. Whether your playbook is just not running and you don't know why, or if you actually want to get some suggestions for what your next steps are. Okay. And if you want to find me, I'll be in the Red Hat booth at these times today and tomorrow. You can reach me on email. You can have a look on my GitHub. I try to upload some of those playbooks as gists every so often, but I haven't been doing that very regularly, but I will try to update more of them because I do find that they're very helpful. And sometimes I'm on IRC with this handle. So, thank you all. And if you think I've talked too fast, as far as I know, this will be recorded so you can reduce the playback speed. So are there any questions? Yeah, it's a lot of information, but again, the references will be available. And if you want to reach out and tell me that you've done any of this and it's been successful, I will be glad to hear that.